And then by extension, if the great formulators of this science are really three men. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari is one of them, and he is a 4th century scholar who was one of the great Mu'tazilite scholars, and then he made Tawbah from that. And he became the great advocate of what's called the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which I'm going to get into in a moment. But Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari is a very maligned scholar of late. Historically, he was recognized by everybody as being one of the great imams. I mean, even Ibn Taymiyyah is very clear in his praise of Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. So when people attack the Ash'aris today, it's very odd for people that know the Islamic tradition to hear that. It doesn't mean that there weren't groups that were opposed historically, but they were never in numbers large enough to really warrant any, serious consideration. And then the other one is Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who was in what's now Afghanistan. He was from there, and they were living at approximately the same time. And then the third one is probably Imam al-Tahawi. Now, generally, and what I was taught by a lot of my teachers was that the people of Haqq are the Ash'ari and the Maturidi, and everybody else is off. But I think it's undeniable that there is a third group of people that are the Athari people, and I think it's important to acknowledge that, because it's not really fair to isolate that group and say that somehow they're not part of the tradition, because they are. And one of the great examples of that is Ibn Abdul Barr and the ulama of the Murabitun. Very few of them were Ash'aris. It was Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi who brought the Ash'ari madhab to Morocco and to Andalusia. But prior to that, they were more Athari in their approach, and they tended to really not like what is termed sometimes in English speculative theology or kalam, so dialectical theology. But it's important to distinguish between the Athariya, who are the people of Athar, and stick to the text without really bringing in what are called the Aqliyat, or the rational sciences, to buttress the theology. Those people were not Mujassima. They were not literalists. They were not people that thought that certain verses in the Quran were to be taken literally. They understood those verses did not mean what they outwardly were saying, but they were not going to say what they meant. They really left it to nu'minu biha ala muradillah. We believe in them according to what God says about them. And that is also a position within the Ash'ari and the Maturidi schools also. So that's not just the Atharis, but that is the early scholars and some of the later scholars from those schools. So when we study creed, we have to understand that creed develops out of problems. When the Prophet ﷺ came, he was not a theologian in that he didn't come with this systematic theology. He came with a truth about God, that God is one. And the Quran has a theology in it. But the Prophet ﷺ did not bring a type of creed that's formulated the way they are now. This came later. And the Sahaba were people that were in such a powerful experiential Islam. They were living these truths. They were, Imam Ali radiallahu anhu said that I never saw anything except that I saw God before it, after it, and in it. In other words, that he was witnessing the af'al of God, the acts of God in creation. The idea that no leaf falls without the knowledge of God. So being aware of God in that way, in a very real presence, that was very much how these people were. And so they weren't going to debate things, and they just weren't interested in that. So when the Muslims came up against the Christians, who had a very profound theological tradition, because Christianity has much more emphasis on theology than it does on law, whereas the Jewish and the Muslim traditions have been more focused on law, on fiqh. So when they came up against the Christians in Syria and Iraq and Egypt, suddenly they were asking them questions they'd never been asked before. Like, the Quran says that Jesus is the kalima, the word of God, which in Greek is logos. And in the Gospel of John, it says in the beginning was the word, the logos, and the word was with God, and the word was God. So does that mean that Jesus is the logos? In other words, is he the eternal word of God? And so nobody had ever thought about that. And then they said, and when you say the Quran is kalam Allah, does that mean that the Quran is the logos? In other words, is the Quran created or is it uncreated? Nobody had ever asked them these questions. And so suddenly they were forced to think about things that they hadn't thought about before. Hence, theology. Because that is the means by which they were able to really come to some conclusions about these shubuhat. Because these are obfuscations that come into the teaching that create problems in the hearts of people. And the resolution of the problems comes through working through these problems and coming to conclusions about them. And this is what the mutakallimun did. This is what the theologians did. And they created creeds. And Imam al-Tahawi's creed is one of the earliest creeds. Abu Hanifa, there's a creed that's attributed to him that precedes this. And there's a debate, a big debate, about whether he actually wrote it or not. But Imam al-Tahawi is definitely in the line of that creed. Imam Tahawi's creed is almost identical to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari's creed. They differ on 4 points, according to Imam al-Subki. And that's it. Abu al-Hasan, Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, whose creed is articulated in the Nasafiyya, is also very similar. He differs on certain things. And there's some interesting differences. And they're differences that are insoluble, in that you're not going to come to some kind of, you're not going to resolve these problems. So they're just there. And they are what they are. So having said that, the founders of these creeds are called the founders of this science as well. Now, Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was very fortunate in having an absolute genius student, Abu Bakr al-Baqillani, who is probably one of the greatest intellects in human history. I mean, anybody that really looks at his work and his genius would have to come to that conclusion. And he really, he in essence is really one of the saviors of Islam, because at the time when the massive onslaught of Hellenistic rationalism was coming, when there were just so many sects, and he was refuting all these people with just really extraordinary brilliance and intellect. And one of the things that is important to understand about these creeds is that people that attack them, and I can really safely say this, almost have never studied them. and I found this consistently, what they do is they read their teachers who quote these people, and then they attack them from within their own frames of reference. And they rarely actually study, because when you say that, oh, this is a bid'ah, what is a bid'ah exactly? You show me where the bid'ah is. And they'll say, well, it's a bid'ah to say this or that. For instance, it's a bid'ah to say that the Mus'haf is not the Kalam Allah, which is an Ash'ari position, that when you say Kalam Allah about the Quran itself, the Mus'haf, that's why the Muslims differentiate between Mus'haf and Quran, right? We call the Mus'haf is the copy of the Quran. It's called a Mus'haf. And we use it when we say Quran, we're really saying it like majazan. So, but when we say the Quran, what is the Quran? The Quran is Kalam Allah, غير مخلوق. It's the uncreated word of Allah. إنما كلامه قديم ما فيه تأخير ولا تقديم ولا نعم ولا لحن أو إعراب وكل أو بعض أو اضطراب. You know, when the Quran is the word of Allah. It doesn't have syntactical precedents and antecedents. It doesn't have lahan, articulation. It doesn't have i'rab, inflection. It doesn't have part or universals or particulars. إذ كل إلى الحدوث انتسب, because all of these things are created by their nature. ككون علمه مكتسب ككون علمه على مكتسب, like saying God has acquired his knowledge. So when you say the Quran, the Mus'haf is Kalam Allah, we say that out of adab, because you don't want to say it's not the Kalam Allah. That's not the Kalam Allah. You can't say that. It is the Kalam Allah. But it's not the Kalam Allah that is غير مخلوق, because it is in the world. It has paper. It has ink on paper. And it's language that came into the world. Whereas the Kalam Allah that is Qadim is the meanings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala articulated in his essence. It's the meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in his essence. So that's an example of solving a problem where these people were saying, are you saying that's uncreated? And if you say, well, yeah, that's uncreated, then you have a religion of people that think things that are created are uncreated. But if you say that the Quran is uncreated, essentially, then what you're saying is an attribute of God is created. The sifa of Allah, because kalam is a sifa of the mutakallim. The speech is an attribute of the speaker, the one speaking. And so if you say that his attribute is created, then you're saying that Allah is created, that there's an attribute that's created, and that creates a problem. And so this is in essence what these men were dealing with. And they did an extraordinary job. When you get to the free will and the determination, are human beings determined or are they free? These are paradoxical problems that have befuddled all the religious traditions that deal with these subjects. But if you look at the way they resolve them, they're quite stunning. They're still limited by language, but they're still quite stunning. And that's so when we talk about the founder, we're talking first and foremost that it's God that gave us this knowledge. It was transmitted by the Prophet ﷺ, but it was formulated by these great intellects that the community was provided with. And we believe it's providential care, because the Prophet ﷺ said that this knowledge would be protected by people in each generation. They protect it. And so that's what they've done. And Imam Tahawi is one of the great people of that science, and that's why his creed is so important.